Hi, everyone, and thank you for the introduction. So, welcome to our session to talk about good data governance practice updates. There are three presenters in this session that I would like to introduce to you. Is myself, Sheila Rastegar. I'm a senior compliance specialist with Regulatory Operation and Enforcement Branch at Health Canada. The second presenter is here, Dr. Cheryl Grandinetti. She is a clinical pharmacologist from the Good Clinical Practice Assessment Branch, a senior reviewer with US-FDA. And the third presenter here is Andrew Fisher, and he is the lead senior GCP inspector with MHRA. And all the bios are also available. Throughout this session, the presenters will discuss the risk proportionate approach to data governance. We will talk about importance of good data governance practices. We'll provide you with some updates to E6R3 guideline related to data governance, including the investigator and sponsor responsibilities. And we will conclude with providing you with some deficiency examples and case studies to highlight the importance of these recommendations related to data governance. Now I hand it over to Cheryl to cover her presentation.
Thank you, Sheila. Okay, first things first, this is my FDA disclaimer slide. So today I plan to discuss the risk proportionate approach to data governance, what we mean by this, and how this approach should be applied throughout the data lifecycle. And then later on in the presentation, I will provide a case example at the end. So as we heard this morning, the ICH E6 GCP guideline is currently undergoing its third revision. And I'd like to highlight an important change to this guideline that we've already talked about today. And that is the use of risk proportionate approaches throughout the clinical trial lifecycle. I think it's important for us to understand that this risk proportionality provides the flexibilities when applying the GCP guideline to the design and conduct of the clinical trial. And since this is a major theme in our session today, before we get started, let's just take a moment and talk a little more about how this risk proportionality concept is presented in E6R3. So the draft E6R3 guideline builds on concepts in ICH E8R1, which is another ICH guideline that describes accepted principles and practices for clinical trial design and conduct. And E8R1 introduces and discusses in some detail the concept of building quality into the design of your trial. E6R3 highlights the importance of quality by design and fostering a quality culture, so one that values and rewards critical thinking and where leadership promotes open reporting, encourages investigation, and supports proportionate management of critical errors. The quality by design approach involves identifying factors that are critical to the study's quality, identifying risks to the critical to quality factors, and then using a risk proportionate approach to managing these risks. And this process is done during the design and planning of your study and should be revisited throughout the study conduct, analysis, and reporting. The E6R3 guideline emphasizes that processes and risk management strategies used in the trial should be proportionate to the importance of the trial data and the risk to trial participants' safety and data reliability. So as we start to talk more specifically in this session about the E6R3 data governance updates, I urge you to keep two principles foremost in your mind. The first is this overarching foundational principle that clinical trial quality is considered as fitness for purpose, meaning that the quality and amount of information generated from the clinical trial should be sufficient to support good decision-making. The second concept is the concept of risk proportionality, which I've just mentioned. And taking a risk proportionate approach throughout the clinical trial lifecycle is an important operational approach to achieving the goal of fit for purpose clinical trial quality. This risk proportionate approach extends to data governance activities and would include the sponsor targeting and focusing efforts on those data governance activities that are critical to the quality of your study. So what does taking a risk proportionate approach to data governance activities look like? Well, this approach starts with quality by design, and it takes planning, coordination, and cooperation. So specifically, first, during the design and planning of your study, you should prospectively identify which data, which computerized systems, and data governance processes are critical to data integrity and clinical trial quality. So we're talking about the data and the processes, if inaccurate, not performed, or performed incorrectly, would threaten the protection and safety of trial participants or the integrity of the study results. And this would be dependent on your study and study design, so there is no one size fits all. Secondly, again, during the design and planning phase of the study, and even throughout the study conduct, you should ensure input from all trial personnel, including your data scientists and your key data governance service providers, to help identify the critical data and the critical to quality systems and processes and risk to those systems, processes, and to the data. You should also ensure input when you're developing and implementing your risk mitigation strategies. Third, focus resources and monitoring on the identified critical data, systems, and processes to ensure the reliability of the data throughout the data lifecycle. Fourth, ensure there's a shared understanding by all trial personnel of what is critical to quality, so communication is key. Fifth, review and evaluate risk to the critical to quality factors throughout the trial and update your risk assessments as necessary. So for example, when there are key changes made to the protocol and other plans and trial processes. Again, involve your data scientists in this process. And then finally, you should document your risk assessments and your implemented risk mitigation strategies. So section 4.2 of ICH E6R3 is on the data lifecycle, and it includes new and expanded text on data capture, review of data and metadata, data corrections, data transfers, and finalization of data sets prior to analysis. You'll hear more about these and the data lifecycle throughout this session. But to quickly summarize, the risk proportionate approach to data governance should be used and applied throughout the data lifecycle with a focus on critical data and the systems and processes that help ensure data quality. And so with that introduction, I'm going to pass the baton back to Sheila, where she'll introduce some key data governance processes, which will be the basis of many of our case examples today.
Thank you, Cheryl, for the great introduction on requirement for implementation of risk proportionate approach throughout the clinical trial lifecycle. The focus of my presentation will be on data governance in management of computerized systems. And as part of the presentation, I will talk about importance of good data governance practices. The new section in ICH E6R3. I will introduce the 4 key processes for the full data lifecycle. I will talk about responsibilities of sponsor and investigators related to data and record and management of computerized systems. I will talk about requirements for validation of computerized system and conclude by providing examples of validation deficiencies observed in computerized systems. Data governance framework is a set of policies, guidelines, and processes that enable effective management of the data. And there's a great emphasis on quality in the new guideline. So it should be taken into consideration that quality should be designed in the clinical trial using risk proportionate approach. The quality and the amount of the information generated throughout the study should be sufficient to provide reliable results and to protect the safety of the participants in the study. So two key elements that we are focusing on through this session are quality in the design and conduct of the study, and also risk management and risk mitigations. Data governance provides guidance on appropriate management of data integrity, being completeness, accuracy, reliability. It provides guidance on traceability and security of the data. These are all critical factors for data quality that would allow accurate reporting, interpretation, and verification of the trial results. It also provides guidance on handling of the data and record keeping, how to obtain reliable results. It also, the risk proportionate approach applies to data governance activities. So we should implement risk proportionate processes and fit for purpose system controls. It provides requirements on relevant metadata and audit trails to be in place, and how to have structured data transfer and migration approaches. This section should be read in conjunction with ICH E8 and E9. There should be consideration for quality in the design and conduct of the study, as Cheryl stated, with identifying the critical factors to the quality and manage the risk for those factors. The systems and processes should be designed and implemented in a way that's proportionate to the risk to participants and reliability of the study data. The new section, data governance section of R3, introduces the following 4 processes for full data lifecycle with emphasis on criticality of the data, and they should be implemented proportionately and documented appropriately. So the process number 1 is to ensure data protection of participants' confidential data. Process number 2, to ensure computerized systems are fit for purpose and used appropriately. Third system, to safeguard essential elements of the trial, such as randomization, dose escalation, and blinding. And the fourth system, to support key decision-making, such as data finalization prior to analysis, unblinding, allocation to analysis data sets, and changes in clinical trial design. The 3 presenters in this session will expand on these 4 key processes and provide example of deficiencies and case studies relevant to these processes. Andrew will cover process number 1 and number 4. I will talk on process number 2, and Cheryl will expand and talk about process number 3. So the focus of my presentation from now on is on the second process, to ensure computerized systems are fit for purpose and used appropriately. So what are some of the investigator responsibilities in terms of records that's identified in the new guideline R3? In generating, reporting, recording data, the investigators should ensure integrity of the data. The investigator should ensure that data systems deployed by the sponsor are used as specified per instructions. And also the investigator should ensure the accuracy, completeness, legibility, and timeliness of the data reported to the sponsor in data systems. What are some of the responsibilities of the sponsor in regards to data and records? Sponsors in general are responsible to ensure requirements of the computerized systems are addressed and implemented in a risk proportionate manner. They should ensure integrity and confidentiality of the data. They should apply quality control to all relevant stages of data handling to ensure that the quality is in place and the data is of sufficient quality to provide reliable results and to protect safety of the participants in the study. They should ensure that data collection tools are fit for purpose and are validated. and should ensure documented processes are implemented to ensure the data integrity for the full data lifecycle. When using computerized system, there are more specific requirements for the sponsors. They require to have a record of the computerized system. This includes the use, functionality, interface, and validation. They ensure requirements for the systems deployed, such as the requirements for validation, for audit trail, for IT security, backup, disaster recovery, user access management. All of those requirements are implemented with documented procedure and adequate training. They need to assess and document whether systems deployed by the investigators are also fit for purpose, and ensure that there's a process in place for investigators and service providers to be able to report to the sponsor if there are any defects with any of the systems being used. Risk proportionality applies to computerized system as well, to ensure that the computerized systems are designed and implemented to the criticality of the data, to ensure protection of the safety of the participants participating in the study. As such, the sponsor is responsible to ensure expectations of the systems are addressed in a risk proportionate manner. The sponsor should review whether the systems used by the investigators and institutions are fit for purpose and conforms to the established requirements for completeness, accuracy, and reliability. And the responsible party should ensure those developing computerized systems are aware of the intended use and regulatory requirements. So to apply the necessary efforts in the design of those computerized systems to comply with these requirements. Data governance establishes policies and procedures, while data management uses those policies and procedures to create and compile good quality data. There are 4 principles to data management as listed here: to collect the right data with the right tools, to collect complete and accurate data to support data integrity, to apply appropriate controls, and to be able to produce sufficient information and to provide a complete clinical study report. I will focus on the 3rd aspect of the principle for applying appropriate controls to expand on. In applying appropriate controls, it should be taken into consideration to have adequate procedures and personnel training, to have control on data flow, being data transfer, data import, data interfaces, and more importantly, to have system controls. As part of the system controls, it's security of the system, it's access control, it's validation. These are the 3 important aspects of system controls, and also to have quality control of the data and perform data validation activities. I will take the validation aspect now of the controlled system controls. There are 3 principles for the validation: to have appropriate controls of the systems to be in place. Documentation exists to support the application of those controls, and the systems is fit for purpose. As with any recommendation in the R3 being heavily focused on risk proportionate approach, the approach to validation of computerized system are also based on risk assessment, taking into consideration the intended use of the system, the purpose and importance of the data being generated, processed, maintained, and retained in the system, and the potential of the system to affect the safety, well-being, right, and participants, or the integrity and reliability of the results. Validation should demonstrate that the system conforms to the established requirements for completeness, accuracy, and reliability, and the system can perform in a consistent manner. I also would like to bring to your attention that validation should be maintained throughout the life cycle of the system. As with any data system, there's a potential for having some system failures. There should be processes established and be in place to mitigate the risk. There should be contingency procedures in place to prevent loss or lack of accessibility. There should be mechanisms such as help desk support in place to document, evaluate, and manage issues, and to have continuous risk assessment throughout the study. And also defects and issues should be resolved based on criticality related to the timelines. So issues of higher risk should be addressed more timely. Now I'm going to walk you through some example of validation deficiencies observed during the inspections. The first example, there was the database use was not adequately validated for the intended use. The ECRF was not designed or validated to collect per protocol the primary efficacy endpoint of the data, which is a very critical data point in the study. And the impact of this caused for the data collected to not contain all the data variables needed to properly assess and analyze the primary endpoint of the study, as at the end we had incomplete data. On the right-hand side, I quoted some of the requirements as stated in E6 R3 to link the recommendations of R3 to the issues and deficiencies identified. As you can see on your right-hand side, it says the approach to validation should be based on a risk assessment, consider intended use, and also validation should demonstrate that the system conforms for completeness, accuracy, information, which in this case, we did not have complete data. The second example, there was lack of adequate documentation for system design, testing, and change control procedures. So as a result of that, we did not have adequate information, and we had incomplete evidence of validation. And again, the link to requirements of R3, as you see on the right-hand side, are very clearly speaking to those deficiencies. So that's why I just wanted to bring to your attention the importance of following the recommendation of the R3. Another example, the system test script execution record did not include testing of all the requirements. There was a critical functionality testing for randomization in the IRT system that testing was not performed, which resulted in participants to be randomized incorrectly. And again, there are requirements for testing of all the requirements, especially the critical functionality, which in this case was the randomization, which was not done. There were issues identified with the design and control. There were some missing adverse event pages for the corresponding SAE pages. As such, the information on the SAE pages captured were incomplete, and it did not have all the information without having the corresponding adverse event page for assessing SAEs. And the impact was data quality for safety assessment. And again, the requirements are on the right-hand side, linking to the deficiency. The last example, audit trails were not complete, as there were no audit trail for deletions. And that's, again, something that was not done completely. And the requirement on the right-hand side says that systems should be designed to permit data changes in a way that initial data entry, any subsequent changes, or deletions to be documented. And this was a data integrity issue. As Cheryl stated, when you're using a quality by design approach, you are designing quality into your study and identifying the critical factors that impacts the quality. to potentially have an impact to participants' safety or reliability of the data, and you need to manage the risk to those critical to quality factors with a risk proportionate approach. So to summarize, what were some of the critical to quality factors in the example of validation deficiencies we observed? One was to design per intended use and according to the protocol. Data integrity principles should apply during the system design, taking into consideration the criticality and importance of the data being generated, maintained, and retained in the data system. System should conform to the established requirements for completeness, accuracy, reliability, and functionality testing to be performed in general, and in particular, critical functionality testing to be performed, which, if you recall, in the example I provided, that randomization was a critical functionality testing that was not done. And lastly, to have documented procedures in place from beginning to the end for study design, validation, functionality testing, setup, installation, change control, all the way to decommissioning of the system. Now I pass it to Andrew Fisher to cover his presentation. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to address the first, number one, which is relation to participants' confidential information protection, with an example. But first, let's see what ICH E6R3 says about protection of such information. It does define confidentiality in terms of prevention of sharing of information with unauthorized individuals, and it's clear that participants should be told during the informed consent process that any confidential information on trial records will be kept confidential, both in the discussion and in any of the trial materials used. And it's therefore a requirement for the sponsor to ensure that this confidentiality is maintained and implement appropriate measures to protect this information from unauthorized access. Participants' confidentiality is a right, one of their rights, and therefore any factors in the trial design that could impact on these rights, resulting in a breach, needs to be part of the risk assessment, and then controls need to be put in place to mitigate the risk. The controls needed need to be proportionate, and that depends on the nature and the extent of the confidential information that is being assessed. It's also important that computerized systems that are used for any confidential information are also considered in this assessment to make sure there's no risk of unauthorized access and a breach of the participants' rights. So the example that I'm going to talk about is from an MHRA routine GCP surveillance systems inspection of a CRO, and the trial was selected as an example trial to be reviewed for GCP compliance, so there was no trigger in relation to confidential information management. So during the inspection, the inspectors discovered serious breach of participants' rights to confidentiality, which resulted in a critical finding. So this comprised of confidential data were contained in the CRF, and obviously its audit trail, and were accessible to all members of staff of the sponsor and the CRO who had view rights in the ECRF. The data was stored outside of the UK, EU, actually in the USA. The participants hadn't given their consent for these data to be shared with the sponsor or the CRO or transferred out of the UK. And they were told that their data would be pseudo-anonymized. And there was no protocol or other document that was provided to the MHRA or to the Research Ethics Committee that stated these data would be captured in the ECRF and available to the sponsor in this manner. So you're all thinking, well, what data are we talking about? Well, the trial was a decentralized trial, and the first visit was an on-site visit, and then remote follow-up was undertaken of the participants And that was done by accessing the NHS hospital episode statistics, which is a national system. So they could look at that and identify any hospitalizations of the participants, which was part of the endpoint of the trial. In order to do this, they needed the patient's date of birth and their unique NHS number to link the data together so they could pull the right data out of the NHS systems. Additionally, the analysis in the trial wanted to consider the background social deprivation index of each participant. And in the UK, the SDI requires specifying at the street level, and a full postcode for each participant's home address was therefore required. In the UK, this would narrow down the location of a participant's home address to potentially just a very small handful of addresses. So whilst there may be valid reasons for having this data for the trial design, the issue was that it hadn't been fully considered. So what did go wrong? Well, the CRO did their own assessment, and they decided that they didn't understand that the data was going to be in the CRF. All the protocol and the consent materials didn't talk about the data that they were collecting. So during the protocol review and the review of the information sheet, it wasn't picked up in the approval processes. The risk assessment for the computerized system didn't require any consideration of risk to participant confidentiality in terms of the data collected, consent and access controls. And this was an unusual situation for the CRO. It's not very often that you see this type of data being collected in clinical trials. They're usually anonymized. And so there was no procedures in the organization to address how to manage such data at all. So what critical to quality factors could have prevented a breach of the participants' confidentiality and could have been assessed? Well, they could have seen the need for this data in the trial design and thought about it as part of the risk assessment. They could have thought about the best way to use a computerized system to manage this data. So is the ECRF that everybody's got access to the best place to put this? They may have thought of a separate dedicated database instead. They could have thought about where to keep the data and who needed access to it, when and why. So if it was to do with the analysis, perhaps the statistician only needed access to that particular information in order to do that analysis, and not everybody in both organizations. They could have looked at the consenting process to make sure that patients were properly informed of what data was going where in relation to the trial design. So what corrective actions did the CROs make? Well, they changed the storage location of the data, and they also liaised with the Research Ethics Committee to confirm the actions required in regards to communicating with the patients regarding the breach. They also looked to see if there were any other trials that this could have happened, to see whether it was a systemic issue, which it wasn't. They changed the access rights to the specific data in the ECRF. And I put a note there that a new point in ICH E6R3 does cover making sure that access rights are appropriate. And they also removed the confidential information from the audit trail by running a script. And again, this is an example of an exceptional circumstance where you might need to modify an audit trail, which is contained in the public consultation E6R3. In terms of preventative actions, the CRO needed to update its procedural controls in relation to the management of confidential information. So this included revisions made in its quality management system in terms of risk assessment and management processes in relation to the need for such information as part of protocol development, and informed consent materials production, and the data life cycle in terms of relation to confidential data. And of course, making sure that everybody is trained in all these procedures as well. So in summary, the CRA failed to have an appropriate risk assessment of the trial design in relation to confidential information. So the trial participants weren't told what such confidential data would be collected, and why and where the data would be stored. And the computerized system was built with no mitigations to the risks of having such data contained in it, and appropriate access controls to the data weren't in place. So a risk-based quality by design approach advocated by ICH E6R3 to include the risk to participants' rights to confidentiality in trial design in trials that needed this data would have prevented this. So the next process in full data lifecycle, I'll look at an element of number 4, and this is in relation to data finalization for decision making. ICH E6R3 suggests that sponsors should define what the quality of the data needs to be in order to give reliable analysis results and then the decisions made upon them. So, for example, does every single data point need to be checked and queries raised and resolved? Is there some data that you can tolerate a level of error or variability in without actually impacting the overall results of the trial? Which data needs to be used in which specific analysis? So for an interim analysis, it's just part of the data compared to the final analysis. So defining the data you need for an analysis and the quality of it. And then the processes and procedures that are set out on this slide in relation to data management can then be used in the appropriate way on that critical data to meet the defined quality. And these can then be adjusted depending on what the data is used for. For example, a DSMB may be quite okay with just reviewing accumulating AE data, which may contain both monitored and unmonitored data, so QC'd and non-QC data. But then if the DSMB is deciding on the next dose to escalate to a higher dose, in that case, they might want to make sure that the quality of data is really high and fully QC'd and monitored. So what the purpose of the data is for also relates back to its quality. And then how can it be assessed that the processes you decided to use have actually been followed? So what essential records are going to be maintained so that you can see that the processes have been followed and that the data is fit for purpose? So is there some sort of summary checklist prior to finalization of the data that shows all the activities that have been done? And then can you drill down into the nitty-gritty of all the reports and records and listing QC records to actually see these activities being done in detail? And then, of course, the access to the data collection tools may need changing depending on the purpose of the analysis. So for an interim analysis, you could just take a snapshot with no changes to edit access, or there may be a requirement to do some partial restrictions or freezing, or the database needs to be completely locked. So how the access changes depends on the nature of the analysis. So here's an example from a trial-specific GCP inspection that had regulatory decisions made both on interim analyses and final analyses submitted to the MHRA. So the data that was going to be used and prepared for the interim analysis were defined in just a PowerPoint slide that said what the CRF screens needed cleaning. There was nothing in there about the laboratory data, which formed a key part of the efficacy data, and that hadn't been adequately addressed. There was nothing in any data validation plan or an SOP concerning the data finalization, and the SOP didn't actually address interim analyses at all. It was just focused on final analysis. The SOP did require a final data finalization worksheet to be completed for the final analysis, but because the SOP didn't apply to the interim analysis, there wasn't one done, so we couldn't see what activities had been done for the interim analysis data. There was a bit of a more detailed plan for the final analysis of all the event-positive patients, and the data finalization worksheet was completed, but it said there were unresolvable queries outstanding, and this was actually contrary to the plan, which said there would be no pending queries, so it appeared they hadn't actually followed the plan that they'd written down. And when we looked deeper into the spreadsheet tracking data, we found that there were 700 queries that were documented as unresolvable, but there was no sponsor review to consider the impact of these unresolved queries, and some of them concerned adverse event data, laboratory results, and also eligibility of the trial participants. So this raised concerns that the quality of the submitted data was questionable, and so the sponsor then had to take an impact assessment and looking at all the unresolved queries to see if there was any changes to the data that had been submitted to us to make our decision. In this case, fortunately, there wasn't any impact, but there was obviously a lot of work that had to be done at this point of the process, which was could have been avoided. So what factors could they have looked at in terms of critical to quality to help them prevent this? Well, they could have looked at what processes there are in place to identify the critical data for the safety and efficacy analyses. They could have looked at how the critical data that they've identified would be managed and processed and declared fit for purpose. They could have assessed what documentation would be generated to confirm that the defined processes actually had been followed, and then whether the critical data of sufficient quality would provide reliable results. So in summary then, the organisation had an inconsistent approach to interim and final data analysis preparation of the data, despite them both being used for regulatory submissions and regulatory decision making. So they were doing different things just because one was interim and one was final, and you couldn't reconstruct what had happened at the interim compared to the final in the same way. And although they'd had a documented process for the final analysis data cleaning, by not documenting all that they'd resolved, not resolving all the data queries, they hadn't followed their own process for that. And thankfully that the queries didn't have no impact, but there's no documented review by the sponsor that they didn't have any impact. So overall, the new text in ICH E6R3 for risk-based data governance would ensure a focus on ensuring that the required quality of the critical data had been defined, and then also that the processes used to actually assure this were actually appropriately documented and demonstrate that that quality had actually been met. So that's my example. So now I hand back to Cheryl for another example and then to wrap it up. Thanks very much.
So thank you, Andy. The final key process that we'll talk about today is safeguarding key clinical trial design elements. And I'll present a case that focuses specifically on the key process of safeguarding the blind. So the data governance section in E6R3 recommends that your trial's risk assessment include the potential for planned and unplanned unblinding, that computerized systems and processes be designed and implemented in a way that protects the blind across all appropriate stages of the trial. This includes managing user accounts and roles for providing data access, and we heard a lot about this throughout the day today. It also includes ensuring that blinding is maintained, for example, when transferring data to study personnel who are supposed to be reviewing blinded data. You should define and document roles, responsibilities, and procedures for access to unblinded information. And you should document any planned and unplanned unblinding that occurred, ensure that the clinical study report accurately reflects any unblinding events that occurred. You should also assess the impact that these unblinding events had on the interpretation of the trial results, and this assessment should also be reflected in your clinical study report. So often what we see is that the sponsors don't consider in their risk assessments the different systems used in the trial and the areas where unblinded data can be accessed and unplanned unblinding can occur. And this case example really illustrates how sponsors can fail to identify where the risks are to unblinding and how these risks can be mitigated. This case was inspired by an actual case, but it's been anonymized, simplified, and changed to illustrate the lessons learned more clearly. So in this case, the pivotal trial to support approval was a multi-center randomized double-blind study. The primary efficacy endpoint was a subjective clinician-reported clinical outcome assessment. Because the study drug caused an adverse event that occurred early in treatment, which could potentially unblind the treatment assignment, the protocol required that each site have blinded independent evaluators to conduct the primary efficacy assessment. These independent evaluators, as I said, were blinded to the treatment assignment. They were also blinded to other patient data, such as lab data and concomitant meds, and adverse event data. And they were not to be involved in any other aspect of the patient's care and disease management. The protocol required an unblinded team to perform certain patient safety assessments during the early treatment phase of the trial. The team completed early dose adverse event monitoring, which could potentially unblind the treatment assignment. And then finally, the protocol required a blinded study team that conducted all other study-related patient care activities. And each team was not supposed to interact with the other team. Each team also had their own database that they were to use to enter their data. And the teams were not supposed to have access to the other team's database. So independent evaluators entered their data in database 1, which contained the primary efficacy endpoint data. The unblinded team entered their data in database 2, which contained the labs and other test results, which if viewed could potentially unblind study personnel to the treatment assignment. And then the blinded team entered their data in database 3, which again contained all other study information. So before we go any further, as an exercise, let's identify the main critical to quality factors related to safeguarding the blind, and specifically during the time that subjects were being enrolled, treated, and assessed in the trial. So first, the critical data is clearly the data that will be used as a basis for approval, so the primary efficacy endpoint data. The lab data and the adverse event data that could unblind study personnel should also be considered as critical data. Procedures that are important to safeguarding the blind in the trial include those related to identifying and assigning roles and responsibilities in the trial, training and communication, because the sponsor and site staff need to understand the protocol design and the importance of their assigned roles and activities in maintaining the integrity of the trial blind. And they also need to understand the potential impact on the trial results if they don't do their job right. Monitoring would also be critical, and it should be tailored to the complexity of the trial and should focus on the critical to quality factors. So which data governance activities do we need to get right to safeguard the blind in this case? And again, for the purpose of this case only, we're going to focus on the time that subjects were being enrolled, treated, and assessed in the trial. So processes and procedures for managing user accounts and system access. So for example, access controls and for assigning and revoking system access, and computerized system training for system users that's commensurate with their roles and responsibilities in the trial. So what were the inspection observations? So I'm sure everyone can predict where I'm going with this, but the bottom line up front is that blinded independent evaluators and blinded study personnel at the majority of the sites were granted access to database 2, the study database that contained unblinding information. So how did this happen? Well, user management processes and procedures were not implemented in a way that was proportionate to the risk to the integrity of the blind. The roles of the independent evaluator, the blinded study team members, and the unblinded team members were not clearly defined at each site so that all involved in this study understood who was doing what. The unblinded and blinded roles changed throughout the trial at many sites, with unblinded team members switching roles midway through the trial to serve as a blinded team member or to be an independent evaluator. To further complicate this, switching of roles, the sponsor didn't ensure that access to the database appropriate for their previous role was revoked. The study monitors completed the database access forms for site staff, and confusion of the roles at the site led to errors on these forms. Also, these forms did not capture enough information about the roles and responsibilities of the site staff. The form just said, for example, give Dr. Smith access to database 1. Because of this, the IT service provider, who was responsible for granting and revoking access, wasn't able to provide a second check to ensure that they were providing the site staff with access to the correct database related to their role in the trial. The IT service provider just did what the form told him to do. So communication and training was an issue because the sponsor and site staff didn't appear to understand the importance of their assigned roles and activities in maintaining the integrity of the blind. So for example, the monitors, again, who were responsible for completing the database access form, weren't properly trained on the study design and the importance of ensuring that study personnel were correctly assigned to the right database. The IT service provider, who assisted in providing access to the databases, also didn't understand the study design. Even if the database access forms completed by the monitors contain sufficient information about site staff's roles, it's unclear if the service provider would have detected errors in the request for the database access because they had no knowledge of the study protocol. Again, they just did what the form told them to do. And then finally, there was no monitoring performed on the critical to quality factors that we've identified as important in safeguarding the blind. No one was proactively monitoring system access to ensure that database access was being granted appropriately. The monitoring plan contained critical errors in the section that described how to complete the database access forms, confusing the database names and who should be giving access to which database. And database access errors were identified by some data managers earlier in the trial conduct, and then access to the wrong database was subsequently revoked for those individuals, but there appeared to be no communication with the sponsor about the incident, and there was no formal investigation into the matter during the trial. So what was the data reliability assessment, and what were the implications to the overall study results? Well, because independent evaluators and blinded study personnel had access to and viewed information in the database that contained unblinding information, we could not rule out the introduction of study bias in the assessments related to the efficacy endpoint. So a sensitivity analysis was conducted, excluding subject data that was impacted by the inappropriate access. So it's hard to summarize all that we've heard today from Sheila, Andy, and myself. But our main take-home points, even if you don't remember anything else of what we said, are to identify critical data and processes that, if incorrect, not performed, or performed incorrectly, would threaten the protection of trial participants or the integrity of the study results. You need to ensure input from all trial personnel and study planning, including your data scientists and your key service providers. Focus your resources on the data and data governance activities that are critical to quality. Proactively communicate to all study personnel what data and processes are critical to quality, as this will support understanding of the priorities and resource allocation by the sponsor and investigator site. Ensure relevant training to study personnel that's commensurate with their roles and responsibilities in the trial. And then finally, ensure that monitoring reflects the critical to quality factors. And so with that, I'm going to pass the baton back to Sheila.
Thank you to both Cheryl and Andrew for the great presentation. We conclude our session here. We are going to have a 15-minute breaks And after that is a Q&A panel where your questions will be answered. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody who presented today, for a very informative day. Now we're going to invite to the stage some of the presenters session by session from this morning and this afternoon to address some of the questions that have come in from the audience. So for session one, I'm going to invite Lee from FDA, Hassine from Health Canada, and Andy from MHRA. Great, thank you for joining me. So our first question that's come in is actually for Andy from MHRA. When assessing essentiality of a record, does there need to be a formal process for this and the assessment of each record documented?
And the short answer is no. We don't expect the guidance that's contained in ICH GCPR3, I think there's 26 bullets on what makes a document essential. We don't expect any new processes to be put in place that every document or record that comes along, you have to formally assess it against those criteria and document your assessment. That's just going too far. In actual fact, many organizations will have already done this essentially by having a TMF index. They've already decided what documentation is essential, and they may be using the CDIS TMF reference model that sets out a lot of the essential documents that are expected in a clinical trial. I think the guidance is more useful for any ad hoc documents that come across that are unexpected, and you can just use the guidance to decide whether you need it to be retained or not. So I wouldn't expect any additional processes or additional documentation of assessment of essentiality. It's guidance to just help you decide what goes into your trial master file.
Thank you. Thank you. And the next question is for Hassine. Are there plans to merge and harmonize the Part C Division 5 and GCP training requirements? And are there plans to make a more accessible and free platform training for clinical device trials?
Thank you, Regina. So the training session for Division 5, which is the clinical trial regulation in Canada, and the good clinical practices, they are already harmonized and merged. So we offer several sessions in Canada to our stakeholders on the interpretation of the regulatory requirement. And we have a guidance that is available on the website. I will speak about it tomorrow afternoon. So these sessions are offered all the time. And what we do is just we explain the regulatory requirement or the expectation of Health Canada when it comes to clinical trial using human. And we use ICH E6R2 to explain the expectations. And we already provided several sessions, and we are more than happy to provide others. When it comes to making these presentations available, keep in mind that sometimes they are not, there are changes, and whatever we put or we share with the stakeholders may need to be updated. Currently, Health Canada is working on modernizing the clinical trial regulations. We're hoping that we will have a new regulation early into 2026, which probably will coincide with the publication or the adoption of ICH E6R3. And then most, if not all, of our guidance documents will be updated, and then we will have a different training session for our stakeholders. The last time we provided the training on GCP, it was in 2019 when ICH E6R2 was published, and we provide two sessions, one in Ottawa, one in Vancouver. I'm seeing here clinical device trial. So I'm assuming that the question is about medical clinical trial using medical device. They are under different regulations, and it's the medical device regulation, and there's a part, I think part 4 or part 8, I don't remember, that is about medical device clinical trial. We did the pilot, but right now we don't offer any training because it's different requirement. They don't even have to comply with the good clinical practices or ISO 14, I think 125. We try to incorporate and harmonize all clinical trial regulation into one. So we work towards having one regulation that will cover drug, medical device, natural health product, and even food. But at this moment, we are focusing only on drug clinical trial. I don't know what's going to happen in the future, but we may have training also for medical device, but not at this moment. Thank you.
Thank you. This next question is addressed to Andy, and it's related to GCP harmonization. Is the ICH E6 useful for the statistician?
Absolutely. The current R2 version is useful for a statistician. The GCP is applicable to statistical activities in clinical trials, and during our systems inspection, statistics often is a session that we will spend a lot of time on, looking at how the data is analysed, the quality control and validation of statistical programs and management of data that they're analysing, and production of the analysis TFLs, tables, listings, and figures, for example. And the update to R3 actually includes some specific parts that are applicable to statisticians regarding programming, regarding analysis analysis data sets finalization. There's a whole section on blinding that should be important to statisticians regarding study design and maintaining the blind, and also randomization aspects are covered in GCP. So statisticians are an important part of the sponsors trial team and contribute to the trial conduct, and therefore they should be trained in GCP and apply GCP principles to the activities that they're undertaking.
Thank you. This next question is for Lee from the FDA. When is ICH E6R3 expected to be implemented? Will there be another round of public consultation after Annex 2 development?
Yes, and yes. If you remember, I had that really long mouthful of the ICH E6R3 EWG Annex 2 subgroup. So they came together and they wrote the concept paper in March of 2023. It takes about 12 to 18 months for that to come together as a draft that is going to be subject for public consumption. So that actually is next month to about September. It takes 12 to 18 months for that. And then once that's compiled together, the whole ICH E6R3 should go live for the public to see thereafter, about a year thereafter. So we're thinking 2025.
This next question is for Haseen. Will the FDA, MHRA, and Health Canada share their inspection reports for sites in India and China to have a coordinated approach to compliance?
Thank you again. So I will speak on behalf of Health Canada, and then probably I will let Andy and Lee to speak about their respective organization. In Canada, we have several information sharing agreements with various regulators, under which we can exchange information. Besides, we have a publicly available database on Health Canada website where we share inspection for now that they have been conducted in Canada. But again, when we go to India for an inspection or even any other country abroad Canada, and if it's a joint inspection, keep in mind that the inspectors, they speak to each other and they share information. That's what we call them joint or parallel inspections. But there is a legal mechanism through which we share information with our regulators. Clinical trial is global activity, and expect that compliance enforcement will also be a global activity as well. Thank you.
Andy or Lee, do you have anything to add?
Our process of sharing information about inspection findings is set out in the agreements between the regulators. So in some cases with the regulators, we may be able to share an inspection report. In other cases, it's just a summary of what the findings were to inform an organisation. So it depends on the legal agreements between the regulators.
I echo what Andy said, the same with FDA, and I think that looking forward, we set up meetings to collaborate and be able to get even more legal agreements into place so that we can share information and have, this global regulatory back and forth, and at least say, this is what we saw, what are you guys seeing, what's coming in even is what, sometimes we'd like to know, what files are coming in. So I think it's not just the now, it's looking for the future.
Andy, your presentation referred to service providers and not CROs. Does E6 distinguish between the two definitions?
It was a deliberate decision to include the new term of service providers in the new updated guidance, and a CRO is a subset of a service provider. So any organisation that takes upon itself duties and functions of the sponsor or duties and functions of the investigator is undertaking a service. And so depending on what that is, they would may call themselves a CRO, and they tend to be service providers that provide a lot of the activities and duties and functions of a sponsor. Some organisations don't think they're a CRO because they might provide only a small part, say data management or statistics activities, but they're all doing the same thing. They're undertaking duties and functions of the sponsor or the investigator, and therefore should comply with GCP, and that was a deliberate decision to make that clear in the new guidance.
Great. Thank you for all of you clarifying these answers to these questions and for your respective presentations as well. And thank you for joining us on the stage. Okay, I will now invite Debbie of Health Canada, Elena of FDA, and Mandy of MHRA from session 2 for the session 2 question and answer session. Great. Thank you for joining me. Elena, can you talk about the difference between Alcoa and Alcoa Plus? Which is more formally recognized?
Sure, thanks for that question, Regina. So US regulations for GCP, not GMP, they do not formally recognize any of the Alcoas, including Alcoa Plus, Alcoa Plus Plus, or any other flavor of Alcoa that might be out there. So Alcoa is an important standard that we use to define data integrity. We consider it an ideal. In a perfect world, this is what you should strive for. And while ideal, practically speaking, your data does not have to be perfect. It does have to meet all the components. It doesn't have to meet all the components of the principles of data integrity. Of course, we would be very pleased if data did meet all of those components, but it does not have to. So in the end, the important thing is that the data is fit for purpose and that it's of sufficient quality to support regulatory decision-making.
Thank you. Debbie, for the business case on paper CRF, was that the only source document? If so, what's your position about sponsors? That's okay, you're taking control of, can you turn your mic off, Elena? It's her fault, it's her fault. Just kidding. There you go. Okay, good. I'll repeat the question. So for the business case on the paper case report form, CRF, was that the only source document? Was there no other source in the medical records? And if so, what is your position about sponsors creating a paper or electronic tool to collect medical histories?
Thanks for the question. So I know it was a bit convoluted, and I did try to simplify it, but just to clarify, there were source documents and medical records that were created at the investigator sites, but there were also source worksheets which pretty much mirrored the paper CRF. So the entries on paper CRFs were transcriptions, and then the paper CRFs were again used as a reference to transcribe into the electronic CRF. So this caused an increase in the likelihood of transcription errors occurring, and also a decrease in the likelihood that these errors would have been detected. Data monitoring wasn't as robust as it should have been because of the lack of risk assessment. And we do recognize that you can have paper source or electronic source at investigator sites, but when you are using paper source, it's not a sponsor-owned system, so sponsors should ensure that the system that's being used for source data do meet the requirements of the electronic records.
Thank you. Mandy, was the marketing authorization application for the rare pediatric product that you discussed approved?
So sadly, it was not. So despite efforts and the sponsor doing the additional analyses, that was helpful for the assessors, but the assessors had other questions, and there were other questions as part of the overall application itself. So sadly, in this circumstance, we did try, but in the end, it wasn't approved.
Elena, there were a number of questions about password managers or other identity verification systems that don't require PINs. Why wouldn't a sponsor just use one of those options?
Okay, thank you, Regina. So first, I'm not going to try to respond from a sponsor's perspective. But I can say that there are risks to every identity verification system, and sponsors should do an analysis of the risks of each system they're considering. And at the same time, they should also consider what kind of data the system is being used for. So if it's critical data, perhaps a primary efficacy endpoint data, like in my example, then the identity verification system would be considered critical to quality, because if something were to go wrong with that system, it would compromise the application. So in this type of case, robust access controls would be reasonable. Another important consideration would be the ease of use of the system given the study population. So you don't want the system to be of excessive burden that might deter the full participation of the participants.
Thank you. Debbie, are paper case report forms required if we enter data directly on validated electronic case report forms with an audit trail?
So this question can be answered in two parts. So the first part is, assuming if you have paper source, there's really no need to have a paper CRF. And the example that I presented, this was actually the first example that I've ever come across when there's been both paper and electronic CRFs at a site. So that's why it was very confusing to those that were entering the data, and it became the data wasn't confined to one specific system, and it caused a lot of discrepancies there. So I'm really hoping that everyone received the message that the e-system, any e-system that isn't validated for its intended use, results in a negative impact to data integrity. But I think maybe what the intent of the question was, so the second part of my answer will be addressing the scenario when there's a direct entry into a validated eCRF. So the CRF in this case is also considered the source. So in this case, there needs to be additional considerations addressed, and these will include that this should be identified in the protocol. And there must also be provisions in place to ensure that an investigator always has access to the study data in the ECRF, so with no downtime. One of the reasons for this is so that data cannot be changed, access isn't available, and this should feed into your risk assessment as well. Thank you.
Great. Okay. Mandy, if data is transposed by validated automation created by the sponsor to avoid repeating data entries, would that be a concern if all is clear and visible to the investigator?
So thanks for the question. So my answer is always it depends. So in the example that I had presented, one option could have been to use a validated method of data transfer. But there are additional considerations with that in terms of looking at your risk assessment. What is that data that is being transferred? Is that method validated? Is the other, so if it's going from another system, is it accurate in that system? So for example, in the example that I had with the interventional study and the end of study visit, had the investigator confirm the accuracy of that data before it then goes into the next study data database. And once it goes into the other study, it can go into a form in the ECRF, but it would be useful if that was then a viewable only CRF, so it can't be modified and changed, because then you will then have further issues with potential data integrity and reliability. So you probably recommend having a view only form for that as well. So you're really clear on the data flow, on where the data was entered, how you've ensured the accuracy of that, you've ensured that you've got a validated method to transfer it, and then you can't change it further in the new system.
This next question is for Elena. Elena, there were also a number of questions about the use of PINs, security questions and answers. If these were confidential, how did we learn about this during the inspections? How would a sponsor, for example, discover that such an issue was occurring during a trial?
Okay, thank you for that question, Regina. So I'm going to break this down into two parts. So first, given that they're confidential, how do we learn about it during our inspections of the clinical investigators? And so during the inspections for the clinical investigators, the inspectors were focused on the primary efficacy data anomalies. And because this data was collected on an ePro, they looked into the procedures related to ePro access. That makes sense. And what I didn't mention to you during my presentation, mostly so I could get this question for the Q&A, so thanks to whoever sent it in, was that the sponsor inspection was occurring at the same time as at least one of the CI inspections. So we had multiple inspections going at once, and we did communicate with the inspectors quite frequently from the various inspections that were going on to talk about what was going on and what more information would be useful. So the inspector for the sponsor inspection requested the PINs for the sites of interest. And so that's where we got the PINs. We got them from the sponsor, who retrieved them from the service provider who was managing the ePro data. So that's how we learned about the PINs. And later we learned about the security questions and answers. And the sponsor did remark that they don't usually have knowledge of the PINs for various privacy reasons. So that's the first part of that question. And the next part was, how would the sponsor discover such an issue during a trial? So during a trial, the sponsor, that's right, would not have direct knowledge of PINs or security questions or answers, kind of for obvious reasons, but the service provider who manages the ePro data, they should have the ability to monitor this type of information for patterns, right? Whether those patterns are repeated use of the same PIN or PINs that are based on participants' birth dates or other patterns. And it seems reasonable. I mean, I'm not an expert on this sort of thing, but it seems reasonable that they might have programs or algorithms that could monitor for these sorts of patterns. I'm sure there are folks in this room who know a lot more about this than I do in terms of what is possible. But so even without knowing or divulging the details behind what they're finding, I would think the service provider could notify the sponsor if there were concerns like that.
Thank you. Debbie, what exactly do you mean by validated systems, data systems? Do agencies offer a validation, and what criteria must the system meet?
So in simple terms, really what it means is first you have to have a defined system. And then next step is to assess the risk and then effectively control and mitigate your risks. Finally, you need to test your system against predetermined specifications so that you have assurance that it is fit for purpose. And there should be an overall quality system structure in place to drive this process. Larger sponsors have the structure in place, but for smaller sponsors, you really need to have defined standards so that you have the system in place to support the process. And there's several guidances available online, so multiple data integrity guidances. There's a PICS guidance, GAMP guidance, a never-ending list really that's available on all of the agency's websites.
Great. Thank you so much, all of you. We're out of time for this session, question session, but it's been very informative. Thank you. Okay, for session 3, we're going to invite Lee from the FDA. We're going to invite back Haseen and also Jason from MHRA.
Ask you to delete the last question.
Sure, we probably won't make it. So we are going to start with Jason. Jason, what are the biggest challenges or deficiencies noted by agencies in decentralized clinical trials?
So in some respects, they're fairly obvious. That, you know, decentralized trials, they are quite complicated. You've lost the link you had with your investigator, who traditionally would perform a lot of the activities which you're now looking to outsource. So the kind of challenges we see, the bigger challenges we see are very much that, how does the investigator maintain their oversight? You know, what's going on? How do they do it? How does it fit together? Also, how do they make sure they're linked in with the various other parties that are doing the work on their behalf, whether that's the IMP provision, whether that's various vendors of things, all of that kind of lot. How do they fit all that together? Quite a specific one is e-consent, because in reality, industry is not very practiced at it. You know, guidance has been out there for a while, but it's not widely adopted. And in some respects, the pandemic forced our hand to adopt that and get on with that. So, because none of us are particularly practiced with it, we see all sorts of problems with that electronic consent, those mechanisms for obtaining consent for involvement in these kinds of trials. And you don't really have the same opportunities when you see the patient again and again and again each time they turn up to basically correct it. You know, so that kind of thing exists. You've also got generally the complexities of all the moving parts. You know, because you miss that hub, there's a lot to stay on top of. When the investigator is in control of all of the things that are happening under their roof, whether that's imaging, whether that's the blood collection, whether that's this, that, and the other, they're much more intimately involved with it. And they sort of do it for lots of studies or lots of research studies, general practice, whatever it might be. So they understand how it fits together. Whereas in these decentralized trials, they don't really have the same links. They don't know the same people. They don't really have the same contacts. Every trial is different. We know this to be true. So the complexities of things don't necessarily help matters much, and they don't have the ability just to walk down the corridor and go and have a chat or go and get something fixed. I don't know, Haseen, do you have anything to add?
Thank you, Jason. I'm going to provide the Canadian perspective. So, yeah, there is few challenges, at least from a regulatory perspective. As you know, in Canada, and Alicia explained that well, we didn't define what's a clinical trial in the regulation, and we are just using the definition provided by the ICH guideline. However, on the other side, the regulation states that only one investigator per site, and that poses some challenges, at least for our inspectors, on how to deal with these decentralized clinical trials. Also, shipping drug to the sites, there is like particularities when it comes to these satellite sites or directly from the sponsor to the homes of the participant. There's an issue also, where should the inspector inspect? Where should the records be kept? And also we have particularities when it comes to provincial territorial jurisdiction. As you know, physicians, they are limited to their province and they cannot recruit outside and provide healthcare. We, in Canada at least, we issued what we call the transition regulation for drug and medical device used in COVID trial. And we put enablers there for decentralized clinical trial. Like we we clarified the remote consenting. We expanded who can be an investigator to other healthcare professionals. Practically is the practitioner nurses. But again, there's challenges, but there are also a lot of opportunities for decentralized clinical trial. So if you have anything to add? Thank you.
Yes, I agree, with my colleagues here that the major challenge here is the complexity of the data flow. And, it comes from different parts and multiple moving parts at the same time, which increase the risk of introducing variability to the data set, as well as increase risk, to the quality and the integrity. And as I mentioned during my presentation, it's important for sponsors, to have a robust and well-defined data management, good data management and monitoring, training. These are all important things, that you do for standard trials, but it's even more important for decentralized studies. Thank you.
With respect to that, given the at times lack of data quality for decentralized trials, are they reviewed more aggressively than traditional clinical trials due to this decentralized nature? I'd like to ask Lee first.
So decentralized trials are reviewed in the same manner as traditional trials, and they fall into the same regulations, and FDA inspectors will follow the same compliance program as for traditional trials. But that said, we mentioned how complex these studies can be. So investigators and sponsors have to think carefully how you oversee the trials activities that are being conducted off-site. Again, their maintenance, training, clinical investigators, should think carefully about the data they are signing off, that they are accurate and that they can be followed. And sponsors, whatever electronic systems they are responsible for, they should be able to reconstruct where the data comes from and who has interacted with the data, and basically, good data governance for these types of trial.
Jason, do you have anything that you'd like to add to that?
I totally agree with you, Lee, in that we don't really treat them any differently, but they're of interest because they're new and they're exciting and they're a different way of working. We also receive lots of news about it. So it's obvious that industry itself is also trying to feel its way through these things. And so as an inspector, that's always of interest then to me. Why pick something which we've seen 100 times over, when you can pick something which is a bit more new, a bit more of a challenge? So we don't treat them any differently, but they're of interest to us just because they're new. I'd just like to echo Lee a little bit there. The key bit really there is to very much explain sort of the operational and translational nature of a lot of these things, how things fit together. and for the sponsor to be on top of that, and also the investigator to be on top of that. And I think that places quite a lot of emphasis on particular roles and functions within these kind of trials. So they're interesting to follow and see how they work, but I think we'll see more and more of them. Yassine, did you want to add anything?
Nothing to add, just as in Canada, the same regulatory requirement apply to a decentralized clinical trial or not. And yes, it adds a layer of complexity for inspectors. Thank you.
This third question, Yassine, I'll address to you initially. Are healthcare providers who provide routine medical care to trial participants and thereby contribute data to a DCT considered investigators for the purposes of oversight?
Thank you. So investigator or qualified investigators in Canada, they have to be designed and they have to submit the form, and it's an official function. So just providing routine medical care to trial participant does not mean that you are an investigator. You could be just part of study team or sub-investigator, but in order to be an investigator, you need to really take on and fulfill all of the obligation of the investigator, including be part of the application, be notified by the sponsor, and sign the forms. That's it. Thank you.
Lee, do you have anything to add to that question?
Yes. I agree, the same. If the healthcare provider only provide routine medical care and does not require training for the protocol, then he's not considered an investigator for the purpose of the study.
Jason?
I don't have anything more to add. Nope.
Nothing. Lee, are visits at home to be performed always by physicians? In some cases, nurses perform procedures at patients' homes. Are they allowed to collect adverse events? And how are these then reassessed by the clinical investigator?
This is a good question. No, you don't need a physician to do home visits. It can be performed by nurses. And in decentralized studies, we have seen mobile home nurses, nursing services that will visit the patients at home to collect vital signs, check on the well-being, and they can certainly collect adverse event data. But of course, all this have to be detailed in the protocol, from the beginning. And depends on the frequency of the investigator to reassess this. It will depend on the protocol, but then of course, depends on the severity of the adverse event. The physician might access more frequently if needed.
Thank you. Jason, do you have anything to add?
I think the only thing really to add from my point of view is we rarely see doctors go out to see patients at home. We see plenty of nurses go out to do it, but it doesn't mean it's restricted to just doctors and nurses. There is plenty of opportunity for other healthcare professionals to go and do those kind of visits. So bear in mind the skill set, what they're capable of doing, and depending on what activities are required to be done for the clinical trial, take into account various people's skill sets.
Yassine, do you have anything?
Nothing to add. Well covered by Lee and Jason. Perfect. Thank you.
Okay, we have time for one more question, but we'll need to be brief. Jason, do you need 2 PIs when a single patient is recruited and treated at a hub center and then followed up in a spoke center when both centers are separate legal entities?
So to keep it short and brief, the answer is no, but it depends, like Mandy said earlier on. It depends a little bit on what the spoke needs to do. So if it's the routine medical care, if it's shared care arrangements, those kind of things, then no, you don't need a second investigator. But once they start getting involved in trial activities, generating trial-specific data, rather than part of that routine care, then that's when you need to start to consider whether or not they should be a site in their own right.
Great, thanks so much to all of you. Okay, for session 4, we're going to call back Sheila from Health Canada, Cheryl from FDA, and Andy from MHRA. Anywhere. Yep.
Get this.
Thank you for joining me. Andy, what key validation documents should be requested during a GCP audit?
I guess it depends on the purpose of the audit and who's doing it and why. So, and that varies for us as inspectors. So we have done a series of e-system vendors inspections where virtually the entire inspection is about computer systems validation. And what we do there is look at their process for how computer systems are validated, both the software and the trial-specific builds. And we look at their processes, their SOPs, and we typically do a show me approach where they talk through the process and we request to see information that they generate during that process. So that's specifications, testing records, validation reports. And sometimes this actually involves going into electronic systems because a lot of the validation records are actually kept in electronic systems such as JIRA, to name one. There are others available, of course. And so we do look in those systems as well. Alternatively, it may be at a sponsor inspection and that work's contracted out. We may just see some top level documents. So the user acceptance testing, validation report, specifications documents, etc., that the sponsors obtained. But this is one thing we see is that sponsors may not necessarily have all of the documents, or it varies what they have depending on what the vendors provided to them. So this is what I was saying in the essential documents, that the sponsor should make sure they have access to those other records that the vendor has. So the short answer is that it depends.
Cheryl, where does cybersecurity of ePro systems come into play? There seems to often be poorly secured systems being sent home to patients to connect to their home network. Should this cyber risk be disclosed in their consent form?
Yeah, thank you for the question. First, before I comment on whether this should even be disclosed in a consent form, and before putting language like this in a consent form, let me just say that the risk of unauthorized access to the data should be considered in your risk assessment, and you should implement strategies to mitigate the risk from authorized access to the data. So for example, access controls and data encryption. You should also have cybersecurity plans in place to detect, mitigate, and report unauthorized access to data. Security breaches that may affect safety and privacy of your study subjects and the confidentiality of the data should be reported to the IRB and to FDA in a timely manner. So, I mean, I would just caution against putting language like that in a consent form. You really need to tackle the issue before, you know, when you're selecting your device or your ePro or your app for use.
I have a follow-up question for you. What steps should the sponsor take to ensure the investigator's systems are fit for purpose?
So if you're using data from an investigator system and you're using that data in a trial, so let's say you're using data from an EHR, you know, sponsors really need to ensure that it's of sufficient quality and there's an appropriate level of data reliability. You know, in FDA guidance, we encourage use of ONC certified systems because we feel these systems have built into them the various data security and integrity controls. However, if the system isn't certified, then you'll want to ensure that there are adequate privacy and security controls in place to ensure data confidentiality and integrity. So some of the things that you might want to look at is if the data is attributable. So are authors of records identifiable? Are there audit trails available to track changes to the data? Also, you should review the processes and procedures for use of the system at the site and whether they're adequate and in place. And if the site is using a system that doesn't contain these controls, then you really should consider the risk of using data from those systems in the trial and its impact on the regulatory decision. Records also should be from these systems should be available and retained for FDA inspection. So there are EHR systems that are not certified. They may be certified out from other authorizing bodies outside of the U.S. And so, it would be good, it could be good to collect and maintain that information as, whether the system is fit for purpose.
Andy, a good security system makes passwords invisible to use. So how can a sponsor check what people are using?
Well, I don't think a sponsor should want to check what people's passwords are. Why would they want to do that? I think what the sponsor should be doing is looking at the authentication procedures and protocols that is applied to a system. I don't like whether it's single factor, two factor, etc. And then they should also be looking at the rules that are around password creation. So the complexity rules, which you're all aware of, because you can never seem to meet them when you first tried it. So it's putting 10 characters in, uppercase, lowercase, special characters, numbers, all those sorts of rules to make sure that you can't use previous ones, etc. To make sure that the password are secure. I think that's the approach to take rather than trying to obtain everybody's password to check what they are.
Sheila, what defines criticality of a function in a computerized system?
The answer to that is that you need to make a determination on the criticality of the data that function is responsible for. There should be, again, doing a risk proportionate approach to make an assessment on impact of that, either on safety of participants or reliability of the data.
And what are the requirements, Sheila, for transfers of the data from a system that is going to be retired to a new system?
For the data being transferred or migrated from one system to another, the key thing to have in place is to have a pre-approved plan. You need to have a plan in place to have all the spelled out all the details, roles, responsibilities, the steps, the timelines, and the method of the transfer should be tested, defined, and controlled, and also QCs to be done based on the level of the risk. So again, risk comes into the play, criticality in play, and level of the QC. All of that is also risk proportionate approach.
So those are all the questions I have from your session. Is there anything anybody else would like to add? We have a couple more minutes if you do. Okay, that concludes our question and answer panel. Thank you so much, everybody. And I believe we have the wrap up and closing remarks. And for this, we're going to invite Haseen back to the stage. Thank you.
So what a wonderful day. It's very exciting. So a big thank you to today's speakers. Thank you for the organizing committee. Thank you for the logistic team looking after the location. Thank you for the audio, visual, and broadcasting team on the back, and a special thank you to Jeff. Thank you to anyone who contributed to the organization of this event, whether they did closely or by far, but also a big thank you to our dear attendees, whether they participate in person or remotely. So this first day was full of valuable and very informative session. We hope that we met your expectations. We started with first session regarding ICH E6R3 update. The second session was about digital health technologies. Case study were also presented. The third session was centered on decentralized clinical trial and GCP inspections. Speakers also provided clarification updates from regulators and presented a few cases. In the afternoon session, we have good data governance practices and updates. Several cases were presented. It was a wonderful session. It's important to highlight that this wonderful event was the product of tremendous effort and many, many hours. We are doing this for our dear stakeholders to make sure that we keep this channel of communication and collaboration open, hoping that you would benefit from this sharing information and this experience. So stay tuned. Tomorrow is another day full of other informative sessions, very interesting topics. So until tomorrow, I wish you a wonderful night and see you tomorrow. Thank you very much.